Good morning. Welcome back, everyone, to the final day of AV Urban Art 2026. I'm Gautam Bhan. I teach here at IHS, and I'm very happy to chair this panel on sacred geographies in the everyday, religion, culture, and urban belonging. We have a packed panel, so I'm going to get straight to it. We will keep the order as in the program, and our first presentation is Whose Name Is It Anyway? The Politics of Naming Places and Spaces in India by Maithili Bhatt of Mount Carmel College. Maithili, over to you.
Uh, Good morning, everyone. I'm Maithili. I am a teacher at Mount Carmel College, and this is my first attempt at writing a paper on spaces. And this is something that I had observed specifically within the city I live, within Bangalore, but it seemed to me to be a national phenomena. So I decided to look more into it, and that is the research that I present to you here today. So there is a particular linguistic nationalist fervor in the naming of spaces, and I'm looking at it exploring it with the specific case study of Bangalore. So Bangalore's history is quite turbulent. I mean, in the present day, we see that there have been many protests over the preference not given to Kannada as a language, and there have been many storefronts that have been asked to change their signboards and everything. And where there was a regulation set out that businesses need to have the names in both English and Kannada. And even during the Kaveri protests, there were many instances where stores, restaurants like Ambur Biryani changed their name to Karnataka Biryani over the fear of being attacked. And the reason that is given is that because Bangalore is in Karnataka, which is linguistically seen as a Kannada speaking state, that it should be for the people who speak Kannada. But the census in 2011, the most recent one that we have, shows that Kannada speakers themselves are a minority within Bangalore, because they constitute less than 50% of the people, and there are different people of speaking different languages and communities that speak different languages that live across Bangalore. And in literature and in essays, we look at how each part of Bangalore is different, vibrant, and varied. It does not belong to, or it does not sort of, the entire city does not belong to one language community, nor is it a primarily Kannada speaking space. So it is interesting to sort of see how the pretext of preserving the language of the state is being used to relegate an identity on the city. And now this case of Bangalore made me ask two questions. Now, who does the city belong to, and who belongs to the city? So the name change itself from Bangalore to Bengaluru, which was a suggestion by late Mr. Yuaranand Murthy. He had written in his essay saying that he wanted people who do not speak the language who come here to at least learn one word. And this change becomes quite tokenistic in the sense that it does not go beyond that one word. What is the point of learning just that one word? And it is not even a typical commemorative name change where you have a historical figure or a legend who tells you more about the space through the name. So it doesn't quite achieve anything beyond that tokenistic change. And there is a certain reclaiming of the Bangalore city text done in this kind of project. But this reclaiming specifically tells, or it's sort of saying that the identity belongs to people who speak a certain language. And this also could thereby constitutes the imaginary that Bangalore is specifically for people who speak the language Kannada. So there is a sort of constant effort done towards this, but once again, creating this imaginary of a Kannadiga Bangalore is something that flattens the identity of the city, which has always been a space that welcomed migrants and that grew and has become what it is because of um, people who have migrated here from other places. And in the in Janki Nair's book, The Promise of a Metropolis, she talks about how there is a certain striving for nostalgia, where we want to look at Bangalore as the city that used to be something else, but there is a idea of a Bangalore that once existed, but this idea of Bangalore is very different from the way it has grown and it has become today. And there is a certain way in which the protests these days want to sort of mimic the Tamil language's identity within Tamil Nadu, where Tamil is seen as almost the sort of the defining identity of Tamilians. But the difference is that Tamil as a language has been deeply woven into the social communal fabric of of the state, and because it was part of a political movement, it is quite different from the tokenistic changes that we see in Bangalore and in Karnataka. And even within Karnataka, there are many other languages that are spoken. Even it is not just Kannada. So once again, when we look at Kannada as the defining language of the state, what is it that what is it that the state is trying to do with using just one language to say that this is the language, whereas communities speak different languages within the state. So there is also the aspect of religion, where there is a certain idea that only people from a certain religion represent the speaker or the identity of the language, where Muslims are not seen as people who are uh, eligible to carry the identity of Kannada speaking. And it is there is a incident where the renaming of street names in this area called Padaranyapura, it was disallowed because uh, it was said that they were not eligible, or so they didn't have to name the place after these particular their particular commemorative names, because there were many other non-Muslim personalities after whom they could have named it. So all of these questions come when we look at linguistic nationalism. Then we have a shift towards religious and patriotic names. So like renaming has been seen as an act of decolonization, where we are saying that we are reclaiming our country's history or our country's identity from the forced identity of colonization. And this is something that this is something that is seen as an act where we are leaving behind the colonizer's identity to create our own. But what is happening is quite different, because at least in a place like South Africa, we see that the street names in Johannesburg, where the names were replaced from the colonizers' names to uh, black artists who contributed to the movement in in South Africa. And in many instances, there is a history behind the names that is given. But within India, the street names are not so simple, because they are named after a sort of uh, almost a sort of going back or a sort of majoritarian opinion. Like, for example, we see here that certain figures who have participated within the freedom movement, their names have been changed into the names of living figures, which makes it almost like we are making a legend out of someone who's living. And we see the co-opting of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose by the far right extremist groups. Then we also see the way that in historic city Chowk, for example, is changed into Bharat Mata Chowk. This is in Jammu and Kashmir, but the fact that they want to establish Jammu and Kashmir as something that is Indian is also quite telling of what is being done, and how majoritarian groups are wanting to sort of lay a claim to the city text fabric of the place. So there is a certain also there is a certain active Islamophobia in the change of the names. These are just some examples that I have taken from the years 2021 to 2024. Except a couple of names here, all the other names have been actively changed from names that depict or that sort of represent the Islamic history that India has had towards a more Sanskrit sounding or towards a more Hindi sounding name. So there is a sort of history that India has had with Islam, and while the argument is, or the majority argument is, that we have been plundered and we have been done a disservice, there has also been incredible research that shows that there has also been a sort of cultural revival and cultural protection during the eras of Islamic rule in India. And there is also the sort of defining of who are the invaders and who are the outsiders, and who are people who belong to the state, belong to the cities, and belong to the country. And in looking at segregation within Indian cities, Raphael Saswin talks about how ghettoization is something that is constantly done to spaces where when the blame is placed on certain communities, that they are the ones who are responsible for their own downfall, but it is something that is actively done to them or upon them, and there is a certain ghettoization and segregation that goes on within Indian cities, and they are refused the opportunity to take part and to be a part of the history and space and the cultural space, and its sort of formation of the historical fabric of the cultural space. And because there is a stagnation in the hands of the majority groups, uh, it becomes it becomes very singular. The history becomes very homogeneous instead of the actual heterogeneous reality of the space. Can, sorry, okay. So there is also a certain almost corporatization that is happening within this with street names. There was a research done on Delhi metro's names that have been changed from the names of the metro stations to the from the names of the metro station to the sorry yeah, from the names of the metro station to corporates that have funded to advertise their brands on these metro stations. So there is an active encroachment over the defining of the city text, where people are not able to play a part in it. Finally concluding, I would like to conclude that by saying that the space is formed by the people who live in it, and vice versa, which is what Yi Fu Tuan believes in. And the act of naming is also like the instances of like names acting as instances of identity in the annals of history. So naming is not something as like frivolous or random as we think, and by prioritizing and preserving one language over another leads to a sort of monopoly, where we see one group's history being prioritized as while the other group's history is being erased. And there is a sort of informative as well as creative memory that acts in the that is present in the preservation of culture. So it's not just the factual idea of what history is, but as well as a creative memory actively created by the people who are a part of the culture. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that, Maitri. So the way I'll run the thing is that I will just leave my questions for you at the end. You can pick them up with the group. So just the thing I wanted you to reflect a bit more on as you respond is to think a little bit about the context of struggles over language and naming in the context of India's constitutional federalism. Because we are one of the, if not the only one, of the very few countries in the world where our states are linguistically organized.
Yeah.
Right? So the question of language and belonging is hard coded into the creation of the country.
Right.
Because that was the only way to see the union hold, is to actually, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Bengal, and Tamil Nadu are linguistic states. Yes. And which means that there is also a way in which practices around nativity and notions of the original language of the state are inherited in the birth of the nation. So how do we then think about what a city can do to unsettle what the state cannot, right? Because in a way, we cannot undo that founding moment, right? And so what do we do with the linguistically federal polity in this question of language? And the second question I wanted to ask you was that, if you see Rahul Rao's new work on statues, and there's a really lovely way to think about how symbolism creates a kind of political field. But part of Rahul's insistence, I think that's very provocative, is to say that moments of renaming also allow moments of linguistic resistance. Right? So it's also about not just Bangalore and Bengaluru, but it is also about then the way in which the use of that in everyday life may not have sanctioned power, but creates also another language feel, right? In fact, it may make some folks, it may make Tamilian Bangaloreans defend Tamil in a way that they may not have felt the need to. So I just want you to think a little bit about how do we read the everyday use of these categories, right, and the formal ones, and how when all say when all the TikTok reels about Amethi and Ayodhya make fun of the neighborhood changes, right? And these are residents who are, using them in comical ways. Is naming also a way to undo some of the right to say you can change the name as you want? We know what the place is called, right? So, how does language allow that kind of openness? I think is really something, yeah. And on a randomly lighter note, I think Anantamurthy would be mortified by the way Indigo Airlines has actually understood what Bengaluru is. They always land in Bangalore and never in Bengaluru. And so it's also interesting, again, as a weird subversion that I don't think he got what he wanted, at least in the airline industry. Okay, so thank you very much for that. Our next presenter is Munazza Shakil, whose paper is called Thresholds of Access, Gendered Spatial Governance, and Women's Presence in Srinagar's Religious and Sacred Urban Geographies. Munazza is an independent researcher, and it's always a delight when one of our own graduates comes back to present. So it's good to have you back, Munazza.
Okay, so to begin with, I would like to say that my work on gender spatial governance in Srinagar's sacred urban spaces is right now at this stage an early stage exploratory research presentation. I won't be presenting findings or conclusions, but I would be walking you all through a set of lived spatial observations that led me to ask a particular question. So I'm going to start with some autoethnographic observations that I, as a hijabi Muslim woman, has felt across decades in these spaces in Kashmir. I'm going to give an example of Jamia Masjid. If you can see Jamia Masjid here, it is organized around Char Bagh, and Char Bagh represents four rivers or gardens of paradise. Spatially, it's expansive, it's open, and it's deeply calming. But women in this very open space is only allowed just one garden. The one that is right next to the women's prayer hall. So this means that three quadrants remain open to men and women are only contained within one. Apart from that, the central fountain that you could see here is also a restricted place for women. The rest of the prayer halls on three sides are also restricted to women. So what happens in these spaces is that women are more often than not redirected to corners or edges, and these idea of where women are supposed to be, where women are allowed to be, it's not uh, by written rules and regulations. Most of the times it's understood, it's gestures, it's tone, it's timings. These are also the spaces where I found there is this everyday contestations and negotiations. You constantly not only fight or argue, or I mean, you don't go to these spaces just to find a place. Sometimes you're not allowed to be in these spaces, and you can't ask question why, because you're not going to be given an answer. So what I've also observed is that there is this constant anxiety when you enter these spaces, and the regulation that is supposed to be external also becomes internal, and it turns to self monitoring and regulation. So access is not denied outright, it is spatially contained. So, how the question emerged? The question emerged again through the repeated spatial encounters of redirection, of movement that was shaped by watchful gazes. If you're a woman, you better believe that there's somebody watching over you, and those are not angels. Um, and access is again regulated through timings rather than invitation. At one particular time, you might feel like, okay, this place is mine. Come to the, it might be men's prayer time, the azan might be given, and you're gonna be literally asked to just disappear. And these moments did not feel accidental at all. So there was these repetition, there was these patterns, and then the emerging patterns and repetitions were across thresholds and entry points. It was across corners, corridors, it was the peripheral zones, and it was also about temporal access. When it's Ramadan, and particularly during the month of Ramadan, certain point of days or certain times like tahajjud or shab qadar, women are allowed, women are, there are spaces that are actively made for women. Eid is a place where women are almost welcome, and prayer hours are, these are some temporality to access, but there's always supervision and redirection. So um, so the question does not just become about how, whether women are allowed or not, but also about what is this governance that is happening spatially, and how does it happen across across different sacred urban geographies. And ultimately, the question also leads to that: who gets to decide it? Who are these institutions? So, just a brief about why this is an urban question and also a contested urban question. So, sacred spaces are not just spaces for prayer or propagation of faith. These are also urban commons. This is a place where people congregate, they circulate. There is this notions of visibility, and also important to note is that Srinagar is a very dense urban city, and it is, and against the rapid urbanization, public spaces are scarce. And in the area called Shehri Khas or downtown Srinagar, where the buildings stand shoulder to shoulder, open spaces are pretty sparse and scarce, but these are the shrines that act as open spaces for people to just breathe to begin with. For women, they are third spaces. When I was one day when I was there, I noticed a woman just brought her children with her. The children ran across the courtyards, and that woman just sat down and took a breath. A second point to note is that in a more or less conservative, highly surveilled, patriarchal society like Kashmir, women, when they are outside, there is this question about what you're doing, where are you going. To say that I'm going to a shrine, to say that I'm going to a mosque, for a lot of women, not just me as a young person, but for a lot of middle-aged married women, older women, is something that does not require any defense. So these are still places where this presence is certain kind of legitimized. And again, shrines there, the amount of presence of women there even led shrines to be called as more feminine spaces, because women were there. There's also a contestant aspect to it because of militarization, because of surveillance, and that surveillance is twofold. One is the state surveillance that happens through police, through military. Second is the patriarchal surveillance that happens, well, at every corner, by every other person. There is also an element of constant closure, restriction, and the control of how of public spaces. Apart from that, areas like Jamia Masjid or Hazratbal Shrine, these are also politically charged terrains. So sacred spaces are key sites where urban governance, gender, and territorial power intersect. So I'm not going to go broadly into Massey, but Massey helps us understand that space is not a neutral container, but produced through social relations. So in that sense, we can read these corners, these corridors, these timings as something that is produced and not accidental, and understand women's presence as structurally positioned, not personal. It also helps us imagine what kind of space would be produced through the everyday contestation and negotiations. um, and now I also want to turn to paper by Zohra Batul, uh, who has done a case study on sacred sites, particularly shrines. So what she has observed is that in shrines, women are consistent participants. Why women come there? One idea for them to come there, and women come from very far areas there, is to sukoon, to feel a peace of mind. But apart from that, women come because of faith, because of other reasons. But during in these spaces, Women sustain it through devotion, first of all, labor. You can see them cleaning the spaces, you can see them contributing, and especially donations. Women donate. Um, and because these spaces have a large public donation, women have even one anecdote I can recall is that uh, women have even sold their gold bangles for the construction of one imambara, for instance. However, women are excluded from administration and spatial decision making, even if they have expressed a desire to be involved. One of the things that Batul also argues is that shrines are also public spheres. A and B, they are also responsible for political education and mobilization of women. So again, they are not merely a prayer site, but something that has far more uses. Uh, so, in short, access and restriction both they coexist, they overlap.
Mm,
Um, Now, the most important question that we are here is what are the kind of typologies that we can say? Because these are different, and the way negotiation, contestations, and governing happen is different. First is heritage mosque. Why heritage mosque? Because it's monumental, it's symbolic, it's politically charged, it has the capacity to hold a lot of people, it's significant in the neighborhood. And one example is Jamia Masjid. Second is shrine. Now, what separates a shrine from a mosque is that there's a presence of a tomb. Because of the presence of a tomb, a woman is not allowed to go in that particular area. So it is
mm,
more devotional than mosque, and it's also something that certain sects or certain orders of people follow. Then there's a khanka. Khanka is not a mosque or a shrine in a sense. There's no tomb. There is a praying space, but khanka was essentially a resting and learning spaces for the patron saints, and they are dedicated to them. An example of it is Khankai Mola. Women are still not allowed in the central prayer hall, even if there is no tomb there. Then there are Mohalla Mosque. Why is it important? Because these are also important for religious education, but if I have to pray, I might find spaces to pray in shrine or heritage mosque rather than mohalla mosque. They simply just don't have spaces, even if they are appropriate and spacious. One thing that I want to introduce is here is Imam Badas. I don't think there's enough work that has been done here, but they are mostly for Shia Muslims. Uh, it's different because there's also space for prayer. However, women are still relegated into peripheries through balcony or through some rooms, and governing institutes. So this is some part of work that needs to be done. However, there are like 4 to 5 understanding of how and who governs and how. First is hereditary and community custodianship. It happens in Jamia Masjid. Even though it's heritage mosque, all the
mm,
upkeep is taken by the family of Mirwais, at least informally. And this committee called Awami Action Committee, that's run by him. There are Waqf and Qaf boards that are state linked. For example, JNK Waqf board, but it is different from Shias in the sense there's less state invention, and it's divided into two segments: Anjuman Shari Shia and All JNK Shia Association. They follow two different rulers, and interestingly, their larger allegiance is towards their own factions in Iran and Iraq, and a part of public funding goes to them also. And then there
mm,
are shrine linked trust. For instance, they are more ritual in their authority. For instance, Hamdani family for Khankai Mola, they are responsible for prayer and propagation. Then there is local community, that is neighborhood based mosques and all. Mughal mosques, for instance, are all under State Department or ASI. So the idea is that authority is dispersed, it's territorial, and it's enacted through space rather than decree. So again, to end it here, so these are emerging patterns, and this point of stage they are exploratory, and they indicate the uh, mediated entry through permission, visibility, the surveillance, and the temporality of it. And the spatial outcomes that I have observed so far is that there is central masculine continuous focus, and peripheral or peripheries are for more feminine and they are conditional. And there's also an absence, for instance, in local mosque. In which you can say women being allocated gardens or borrowed space for neighbors. And the governance is regulation happens through caretakers, guards, committees, trust, work administration, and also inherited religious authority.
mm.
um, So why this matters is because it posits sacred spaces at governed urban environments, especially in Kashmir, and also raises the question of gender citizenship that is produced through everyday spatial rule. So that is me. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Manad. That's a really, really interesting set of emerging arguments, and I look forward to seeing how the work develops. So, my question for you is to I think your framing of particularly the Jamia Masjid in the language of the commons is really interesting. One is, I think, because we often think of the commons, even as it's moved from sort of its ecological origins to urban origins, it still has always been placed in a kind of public, secular language, right? The idea of the commons being open, being accessible. So our instinctive commons are not enclosed spaces with gates and corridors, right? They're amphitheaters and medans and things that, notions. So to think of what one could instinctively think as a contained space, right? One has to enter the masjid. It is meant to be, so it's not domestic, it's not private, you're right, but it's also not public. So I was interested in you using the word commons and not publics. And when you cited Batul, she talked about the public sphere. So I just wanted you to think a bit more about the distinction between the commons and the public in what they are enabled, especially because part of the distinction is the governance question you're raising, right? Is that opening? And I think that there is really, I think the mix of looking at how the spatial design has a lot to do with the governance possibilities. And so, same question as to Maitli. I mean, spatial practices also then become ways of resisting and recirculating, walking where you're not supposed to, being where you're not supposed to. So I'm again thinking a little bit about this, and last thing that I was thinking about is how, particularly in religious polities, by which I don't just mean Kashmir but India more generally, there is a way in which the sacred is given political space, at least in the beginning. Right? It can also be. So I'm thinking of in Mehrauli village in Delhi, where a set of Jat communities in Munirka Gaon are still in Mehrauli Gaon are still the custodians of the Hijron ka Khanka, right? Which is this really fascinating khanka that has its mythologies around certain old trans histories, and how that sacredness has found a place in a deeply contested territory. So just a reminder of the kind of possibilities. So, but thank you very much for that paper. Very, very nice to listen to. All right, we will now move on to Aishwarya Gupta of the Hunnarshala Foundation, whose work is called Claiming Moj, Experiences of Young Muslim Women in Bhuj. So Aishwarya, over to you, and nice to see you as well. It is a good morning for the university. Yeah.
So I am Aishwarya. I am an urban practitioner based out of Bhuj, and the work that I will be presenting is has emerged from a process of making a short film. It's a short Gujarati film called Moj Ni Khoj, and we made it with Sajida and Mumtaz, who are two young Muslim girls living in the largest informal settlement in Bhuj called Camp Area. And a lot of these claims that I will be presenting today have been articulated with them in the duration of making this film over the past year with Nagri Films and Charles Korea Foundation. And here I position myself as a friend who is also a young woman about the same age, an outsider to the city, sharing a common love for street food. This paper is essentially about young Muslim Basti women in Bhuj and how they are making various kinds of negotiations to be in the city. This narrative is woven around the perspective of Moj and how it is being claimed, negotiated, and at times compromised. Moj is a word which is used often by these young girls. It means masti in Hindi, fun in English. In Gujarati, Maja Ma is a greeting to say I'm good. People also say Moj Machu or I'm in fun or enjoying. I will define Moj and what it means for these young women as we proceed. The broader question here is who gets access to which public space? And the key question that I'm looking at is how are marginalized women claiming Moj in Bhuj? The question has three parts: marginalization, Moj, and Bhuj. So there are different kind of layers and aspects of their identity which marginalize them. Young Muslim Basti women. Young women operate within a controlled social environment in a city which is marked by ghettoization. Their basti, which is predominantly Muslim, is located at the periphery of the city. Bhuj is the place, which is a small city in Gujarat. It is a tightly knit city with strong social networks. But what is key to Moj is friendship. There is no Moj without friends. But also that going out of the basti without friends is maybe not as fun and at times risky. So this paper is written through the friendship of four friends, Anisha, Mumtaz, Sajida, and Fatima. Methodology wise, it is based on nine semi structured interviews of young Muslim women from their early 20s to mid 20s. A lot of field notes. I have been meeting this group for a week, for every week, about for the past 2 years now. And some of these things have been drawn from conversations, close observations, and mapping activities. So, Mariam, in one of these kind of mapping activities, was the first one to realize that her city is not the same, that her city is actually limited from the basti to the edge of the lake. While her male friends from the same basti are able to go to faraway cinemas and the hill nearby. Why Moj? Right to the fun city. I begin by nodding to Jonathan and Alka Anjaria's writing on Maza, which argues for taking fun seriously, a stance that might allow for a Mazadar methodology open to the unexpected. I also converse with why loiter to find and uncover what loitering looks like in the small city of Bhuj. While the expansive anonymity of Mumbai allows women to blur into crowds and carve moments of leisure in public, such possibilities are curtailed in Bhuj. In Mumbai, one might even glimpse a Muslim woman with a scarf tucked away as she lets her hair fly in the breeze at Marine Drive. However, in small cities like Bhuj, surveillance is far more intimate, and women cannot claim invisibility in the same way. Here, I talk about three key aspects. The first is about the place and its logics. The second is, if the logics are such, then what is the negotiation? And the third is, where is the negotiation and what is the public? It is common for people to stop one another's scooter and exchange pleasantries. This dense social fabric built upon intimate knowing constitutes what residents call kachiyat, the warmth of familiarity and layered interconnectedness that potentially results in surveillance of young women. Neighbors closely observe who is going where, with whom, and in what attire, creating what young women themselves describe as free CCTVs. As Anisha explains, when I visit the bazaar, word of my presence reaches my house before I do. In Bhuj, ghettoization also defines participation in public. Salma's reflections show the transformation of mobility over years. Her mother, who grew up in the city center, recalls a markedly different experience, one in which women could move with relative freedom, remaining in public spaces until late at night. By contrast, Salma's present day basti, located on the city's margins, is characterized by ghettoization, where mobility is closely regulated. The 2001 earthquake and the 2002 Gujarat riots together amplified segregation by faith, reshaping the city's pre disaster neighborhoods into divided enclaves. Salma recalls, for example, that as a child she accompanied her mother to street Garba festivities. In present, however, such participation is foreclosed and access is restricted to ticketed events. Another kind of way of policing of mobility happens through myths around public spaces. In Bhuj, societal and familial narratives often construct powerful myths around public spaces, particularly those perceived as risky for women. Mariam's experience of living near the foothills of Bhujio Hill illustrates this. She looks at the hill from her terrace every day. She often wonders how the basti will look like from the top of the hill. She is taught to fear the hill through stories of wandering headless bodies in the dark, warnings intended to deter her from visiting. These myths function as mechanisms of social control, embedding anxiety and caution within young women. So, Salma describes choosing to wear a burqa not as a cultural choice, but as a tactical negotiation to be out. The possibility of being followed, whether on foot or scooter, constitutes a persistent anxiety. For some, donning the burqa or niqab emerges as a strategy of negotiation that balances safety, mobility, and social acceptability. The act of covering becomes a means to render one's body less visible to the male gaze, while simultaneously securing tacit familial and communal approval to move through the city. They are conscious of how these choices are judged. Salma, others may think we are conservative, but this is what we have to do. Salma explains, articulating a rationale that reflects what Denis Candioti theorizes as bargaining with patriarchy. Candioti conceptualizes such bargaining as a set of pragmatic accommodations through which women navigate patriarchal power structures, seeking maximum security and minimal conflict within existing constraints rather than pursuing direct resistance. And this kind of marks a generational shift rather than continuity. In many families where no woman has worn the burqa for decades, daughters now adopt it as a response to an increasingly surveilled urban environment. Shah remarks that in all her years of traveling through Kutch, she had never seen a long black burqa. Yet in recent years, it has become commonplace. However, not all Muslim women are resorting to this sort of negotiation. Some women negotiate differently. Mariam says that she finds the burqa restrictive as it is a lifelong commitment and instead relies on her dupatta, which comes out of her bag as she enters the basti and inside the bag when she's out with friends. And this takes us to observe where these negotiations are occurring. And here, the Pani Puri stall emerges as a as a gendered site of relative democracy. As Fatima notes, Pani Puri is a good excuse to go out. It's not that far and we can go walking. On the way, me and my friends, we talk about all kinds of things that we can't talk in front of our house. A small city of Purnia in India characterizes Pani Puri as a sanskari snack, a quick, socially acceptable street food that offers women a culturally sanctioned pretext to access public space. Because Pani Puri is meant to be consumed rapidly, it minimizes the time women spend lingering in public, thereby reducing exposure to social scrutiny. Salma explains how she and her friends deliberately pace their street food outings to extend their time together. If she finishes her pani puri plate too quickly, they order an additional plate of safe puri to stretch out the visit, ensuring they spend at least half an hour at the stall. And at times, Anisha justifies her mobility by framing it as necessary, such as running errands for groceries or her mother's shop. Within this movement, fleeting moments of enjoyment do emerge. A quick stop at the Puri stall or a ride on a swing in the park punctuates her journey, embedding small claims of pleasure within the routine of legitimate movement. Yet this freedom remains spatially circumscribed to the nearest junction, merely 300 meters from their homes and within unproblematic walking distance. While the tastier Pani Puri stalls located deeper within the city remain experientially inaccessible and unexplored. Anisha describes this experience of going to tea stalls. How, after going out once with friends, her brother's disapproval stopped her from visiting roadside tea stalls again. He commented, saying, that there were so many men there, it doesn't look good. Salma contrasts her presence in public with how boys can lounge easily on roads or bikes, scrolling their phones or lighting cigarettes. Together, these incidents underscore persistent tensions around gender and religious identities and the complicated negotiation young Muslim women undertake to claim Moj, even if only for 5 minutes at a time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aishwarya. Again, a really, really nice account for us. And the question I wanted to leave with you is actually partly a methodological one, which is, you know, one thing about looking at the everyday is about looking at needing to pay attention to these very small pockets of time, 5 minutes here, 30 minutes here, right? And I'm thinking also then about how does, in terms of methodological work, how does, if one, you talked about weekly meetings over a period of 2 years, right? And I'm thinking about what kind of archives become visible outside such engagement, and something that you said, right? And then something that Munazza was saying, which is what is the thing you say before you leave? What are the excuses considered legitimate? What are the things that for which permission can be negotiated? So I'm going to the mosque, I'm going to the pani puri, I'm sneaking in, and I'm wondering about the things that we say at home before we leave the chalk hut as a kind of archive, right? Which, and that shifts in that archive of what is acceptable movement, because in transportation studies has long shown us the macro pattern of this, that women's mobility in the city is shorter, specific, and always with purpose. It is all that trips are from A to B for function C, and that narrative has to hold, right? And I think so. I'm just thinking a little bit about also um, if we were to begin to read across sites, across Bhuj, across Srinagar, across cities, what are some common archives that could help unearth the everyday without deep ethnographic engagement in each site methodologically? And the second thing I wanted to have you reflect a bit on is, while we hear this language both of constraint and agency, and I think it's interesting that both in Munazza's and your paper, there is an insistence saying it's not this or that. It's not closure. It's not, there are these moves and rooms, even when the restrictions are real. They are also in a film. Right? So I'm also wondering about this language of saying I'm containing, I'm finding my ways, I'm doing this, but now I'm also doing it on film, which seems to me a claim of its own, right? Which is like, you're not hiding in the pani puri stall pretending to just do a task. You're now on video. So what does the video and the film do to this underground claim making, stolen minutes of leisure? And then how do we reconcile her saying, my brother says don't sit at the tea stall, but now I'm on video, right? So it feels like there is this sort of almost differential publicness. So is the digital not public like a tea stall is, which may well be? Is it almost that the film will screen somewhere else? So does it geographically escape surveillance of Bhuj? I was very struck by that there is a film. So tell us more about the film when you come to the Q&A. Okay, so our next paper is Sumandeep Kaur from Panjab University. Hi, Suman, whose paper is titled Sacred Geographies and Dalit Subjectivities, Reimagining Amritsar in Kuttiveda. Over
Uh,
to you.
yeah, good morning, everyone. Uh, Good morning to the chair and the fellow scholars. So, my paper is, as Sir has already announced, Sacred Geographies and Dalit Subjectivities, Reimagining Amritsar in Kuttiveda. Okay, so first of all, I want to just clarify. Kuttiveda is a short story by a Punjabi writer, Maninder Kang, who is a very renowned writer in Punjab, and his stories are focused on the disturbing period during the 1980s, when there was this insurgency and this whole movement of separatism in Punjab, and the disturbed period of almost 20 years. So, in this story, particularly Kutti Veda, so he reimagines Amritsar from the very beginning, when it was established by the fourth Guru of the Sikhs, Guru Ramdas ji, and coming to the 1980s, that is to when there was attack on Darbar Sahib by the Indian military, and then many innocent people lost their lives, and there what was the role of a particular community in that. So the community that he basically represents in this story is the Valmiki community, which has also been mentioned when this story was published for the first time as Chuda community. But because Chuda is a pejorative term used by the upper castes, so in the modern expression, so it is used now as Valmiki community. So the later editions of the story, when they were published, so this name was used. So my paper examines the how urban space in Amritsar, it functions not merely as a physical setting but also as a kind of powerful social mechanism that produces caste identity, it sustains exclusion, and it also regulates the marginalized lives, and particularly those of this Valmiki community. Now, before I move ahead with my paper, I want to clarify what Kutti Veda means. So, basically, this story was published in Punjabi and I translated it into English. So, when I was translating, this Kutti Veda actually is basically is if we have to like broadly translate it, we can divide it into two words. Kutti is basically used for dog or bitch, basically, and Veda is a place which is like a designated place for the marginalized or the Dalit communities in rural spaces and in some of the urban spaces also, where that all the families of the Dalits, they live in those spaces and they do not have like the right to build their houses outside of those Vedas. So the very name Kutti Veda, which can be translated broadly as dog yard also, it's is an act of violence, and it reveals like how language and space they operate together to dehumanize marginalized communities. Now, this Kutti Veda is set in the Khazana Gate area of Amritsar, a city which is often like imagined primarily as a sacred Sikh space. However, Maninder Kang in this story, he disrupts this idealized imagination by mapping Amritsar through the lived experiences of those who clean the filth of this city. They carry its waste and yet remain socially invisible. Now, this Valmiki community that he focuses on, mainly their work is like manual scavenging. And so, at one point of time in Amritsar, in the post independence era, also, like there were dry toilets like which were built on the upper floors of the houses of upper caste people, and these Valmikis, they used to collect, particularly the women of the houses, they used to collect these dry toilets, and then they used to carry the filth and to the outer areas of Amritsar. Now they were not allowed like a kind of they were not allowed inside their houses, but they were just allowed to go on the upper floors and carry that filth and then take it away from their houses. So the story, this the opening movement of this story through, there are these places in Amritsar, Sultanwind Gate, Kirpan Bazaar, and Ajit Nagar. It established that like every footfall in the city is basically a Kutti Veda. Space in this city is not something which is neutral. It is saturated with this caste history, labor, and like the stigma. So my central argument is that like Kutti Veda demonstrates how urban space actively produces this caste identity marginalization rather than merely reflecting them. And coming back to this thing where this term Kutti is basically used, as I said, that it is used for dogs, it actually collapses the distinction between human and animal. Thereby, it denies the inhabitants of this space their humanity even before their bodies appear in the narrative. So, through this naming, the locality becomes a kind of discursive marker of pollution, danger, and expandability. As B.R. Ambedkar argues, caste sustains itself not only through physical segregation but through symbolic systems also that normalize inequality and render it socially intelligible. So Kutivida exemplifies this process by transforming stigma into a kind of spatial common sense. And the naming of the place here also functions what Pire Bordu would call symbolic violence, though its implication aligns with like what is the caste, how caste ideology works in this place. Now, this is very interesting in the sense that like I mean, if you look at the demography of Punjab, Dalits constitute one third of the total population, which is like 32%, which is largest in any state of India. And when it comes to this whole question of caste, it's uh, s- generally like this is like taken very lightly, that there is no the caste system doesn't work in this way in Punjab because of the ideology of the Sikh gurus that was propagated through Guru Granth Sahib. Because if you look at the practice, theoretically look at the religion of Sikhs, there is no caste system, which is like, and all the Sikh gurus, and this is something which he has highlighted in the story also, there is no caste system as such. But however, when you look at practically, that is something which is very, very different. You find all kind of caste divisions in Sikhism also. And if you go to different places, but in many villages of Punjab, there are different gurdwaras also of different castes. Like for Jats, there are different gurdwaras, and for the lower caste people, there are different gurdwaras. So in a way, like in that sense, like when I look at this story, the name itself becomes a, like, it doesn't just describe the space, it actually produces it as object. And it is like, once a locality is labeled as Kutiveda, so the people who inhabit it, they are also read through that label. They are criminalized, they are animalized, and they are morally suspect. So this spatial stigma that precedes individual action, and it forecloses the possibility of providing them any kind of dignity. So and the setting of this story, the alleys and bazaars stretching from Sultanwind Gate to Harmandir Sahib, they also represent more than a topographical description. It is an embodiment of social stratification. And the Amritsar that Kang has presented in his story, with its overlapping sacred and profane geographies, it mirrors like this idea that spatial organization, it actually naturalizes social hierarchies. And the Veda of the Balmikis, or the place of the Balmikis, they are not marginalized, they are not merely marginalized physical zones, but the symbolic spaces of abjection, where city is a sacred heart and it's a discarded outskirts. They coexist in tension with each other. Then the story also reimagines the foundation of Amritsar itself as intertwined with the destinies of the outcasts. Like in a very striking historical episode, Guru Ramdas, the fourth Sikh Guru, he grants land to the group of Valmikis and the butchers, they who seek refuge from the feudal oppression. And his gesture of compassion, however, simultaneously becomes the origin of their segregation also. The allocation of land, symbolically named this Kutti Veda, that transforms inclusion into containment. And this paradox also echoes but Ambedkar's observation that caste society maintains its hierarchy even under the guise of spiritual equality. Now, Guru Ramdas Ji's act of settlement, while it is very progressive, but it institutionalizes a boundary between the pure and impure, and demonstrates how spatial arrangements, they perpetuate social hierarchies even within religious frameworks also. And Kang's retelling of this episode, it collapses myth and history and exposes how sacred geographies are built upon the invisible labor of those who are deemed impure. And in the later sections of the story, the like they anchor the historical violence in the lived realities of post-colonial Amritsar. Like there is an encounter of the narrator of the story with one of the characters called Bunty, who is a Valmiki, and he's a descendant of a woman called Radha, and basically all the Valmikis, those who are presented in the story, they are descendants of Radha. And that also foregrounds the continuity of social stigma in urban modernity. And then very interestingly, the story also presents the terrifying apparition of the primal mother. The Through that, Kang transforms the narrative into a kind of self reflexive ethical inquiry also. So the goddess actually demands that he should write the story, and then the author himself appears in the story. So in a way, like from this perspective, he actually he situates this act of writing in the moral geography also, where his own body becomes, it actually bears the mark of this ethical responsibility that he has to write the story of these Valmikis, those who have suffered from the very beginning, when this city was established, and then that this is going on. So in a way, like basically Kang's narrative, it resonates with Lefebvre's vision of reclaiming space as a site of revolutionary consciousness, and Kutiveda transforms Amritsar from a sacred monument into a contested geography of caste, where every street, courtyard, and drain becomes a testimony to the intertwined histories of suffering and sanctity. And the story's insistence on remembering, the command to write, to bear witness, they turned literature into a kind of ethical act of spatial redemption. So, in reclaiming this Kutti Veda as both historical reality and sacred metaphor, Kangst restores humanity and dignity to those whom history actually has rendered invisible. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Subandeep, for that very nicely delivered paper. I also want to compliment all our speakers for being to really 12 minutes is 12 minutes. You all are solid on this. It's quite an art. Two questions I'll leave for you, Sumandeep, for later for our discussion. The first is I wondered if you could help us and tell us more about the contemporary discursive life of the term Kutivera in its use today. Is it something you would hear? Is it something you could read as a governmental category? Is it something that would show up in a newspaper? Would you hear it on the street? Could it be a term of defiance, self-use? So does it have a contemporary life, or have also other language, like you talked about that move to the Valmiki as a kind of way to speak about things? So are there also now a more contemporary linguistic language that between slang and category, are there other categories circulating that allows to speak symbolically of this kind of exclusion, right? I think that I was thinking of that. And the second is, your argument around the symbolic construction of caste within Sikhism and within Punjab, I think is a very important part and not often realized, actually. Very few people know that Punjab has the largest Dalit population of states in India. And, while terms like the Velivada and the Cherry are sort of, these spatial segregated zones are actually much more common, a term like Kutivera doesn't circulate the same way. I just wanted you to hear more from you on whether you think that because Sikhism also has this kind of structural absence of a kind of Manusmriti Chaturvanya codified hierarchy, does the work of this symbolic violence become even more necessary? Like, do other ways have to be created to legitimize exclusion, because you can't draw from scripture, you can't draw from text, right? So you have to produce. So is it also then that the symbolic work done within in caste and Sikhism actually has a double work to do because it doesn't have scripture to rely on? Does it create a so in the absence of that system in Sikh scripture, instead of being an opportunity, actually just creates a different language of creating hierarchy? So just some reflections on that, I think, would be very useful to hear. But thank you very much for that. And I will say, on my usual light note thing, you also have a very interesting collection of books behind you that I was slightly distracted by for 5 minutes, but then I turned back in. Thanks a lot. Okay, so our next presenter is Miguel Bustamante Fernandez Nazaret from the Center of Favela Studies. So we go from small towns and big cities in India across the world. So Miguel, pleasure to have you. And the title of the paper is Favela as Contested Terrain, Local Categories Disputing Imaginaries of Global Cities. So over to you, Miguel.
Hello, everyone. I'm Miguel. I am currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Favela Studies, and I will present today the presentation entitled Favela as Contested Terrain, Local Categories Disputing Imaginaries of Global Cities. And this is a first attempt to make a global, international debate on on the results of my PhD thesis, in which I've studied the social representations of the favelas, of Rio's favelas. I am from Rio, and the relations between these social representations and the imaginaries of the city of Rio. So, beginning with what is favela in global imaginaries. Uh, Favelas are usually understood in global South dystopias, as in Planet of Slums of Mike Davis. They are seen through the lenses of the northern cities as a dystopia of the urban world. And these imaginaries focus mainly on the precarity of these settlements. And precarity is a way of seeing them as homogeneous, and also as informal settlements, and seen by their high density uh, constructions, and also informal land tenure. And also they're seen in global imaginaries of the popular in a way, as in an abstract way, not in a specific local way, and as the imaginaries of Oscar Lewis' culture of poverty. And but what are the imaginaries of the favela in Rio? What are the local imaginaries of the favela? They are diverse because they depend on where you step in the city. They depend on your experience of the city. So they are contested terrain. They are contradictory. They are in conflict, and they are also negotiated. But mainly, they are seen as black territory because of our slavery past, and because after the liberation of black people, we did not have a public project to include these people in our democracy. So the favelas are seen as a continuity of segregation of black people. Also, they are seen through the lenses of popular culture, but not abstract popular culture, a popular culture that is built in opposition to these imaginaries of favelas being apart from the city. And you can see in this picture of Oruan, a funk musician, holding a gun-shaped object that is built by cameras. And the message is very clear here: is you have to look closely to understand us as culture, as art, because if you look just at a glance, you think we are criminals. And they're also seen as collective power. Here you see that a bandage saying Black Lives Matter, but not only Black Lives and faveladas, lives from favelas, they matter. So the favelas are seen as a representation of collective power. In here you see also Marielle, that was one of the first politicians that was elected with this narrative of the favelas. But also there are other imaginaries of the favelas as informal settlements, as environmental risk and caution areas that are mainly disseminated by hegemonic classes and public administrations. And here you can see start to see a seizure between two imaginaries, one including the favelas in the city, and others that does not include the favelas in the city, in the future of the city. Because when we think about the favelas as informal settlements or caution areas or environmental risk, that bring us to imaginaries with about cities without favelas. So the semantics of on the favelas have changed through the years. I could spend a lot of time talking about all the political conflict context and how semantics of the favelas responded to them. But here today, I want to highlight transformation in this imaginary, because in the early 20th century, the favelas were mainly represented by by in great medias and uh, public senses as not part of the city, as a disease, as something that should be eradicated, and that imaginary was also linked with racism around Black people. And today we have an imaginary of the favelas that include them in the city, but in contradictory ways. The favelas appear in almost all global events that take place in Rio. But as we seen in the slide before, this is not. There are many conflicts around this semantics, and we can see this history through a struggle between two main imaginaries on the cities. One in which the cities are seen through epistemology of progress, and one only epistemology of progress, and aesthetics of modernity, urban colonialities, and leading us to imaginaries of cities without favelas. In other imaginaries, through all the 20th century, different social groups also have produced imaginaries of the favelas as ontologies of the progress. In other words, different people that experience progress in different ways. Progress is not for everybody, and also as an aesthetics of democracy, because they are within their limits and possibilities. They are the ways that some people have found to include themselves in the city, and therefore they are seen as, today, for some people, they are seen as urban diversity, and that lead us to imaginaries with cities, about cities with favelas. So what is behind all these favelas meanings? Uh, they are redefining cities' boundaries, but not only geographical boundaries. They are redefining representative uh, uh, representative boundaries, imaginary boundaries of the city, and they are disrupting a one-dimensional thinking about the city. As you can see here in this picture above, the favela social movement, for the favela social movement, the prospect of a right for the city is not enough to underline their struggles. So they have rephrased the right to the city to the right to the favela, because in this way as the favela is constructed, is built uh, on this struggle for recognizing the favela as part of the city. They have to underline that and rephrase a universal prospect of the right to the city. So here we can see the favelas as opening new urban epistemologies and inciting radical democracies. They are represent, for some social groups, they represent a possibility of a radical democracy in Brazil, in Rio more specifically, and they are also revealing plural urban ontologies of the cities. Cities are not just one ontology, and uh, therefore, behind all these meanings of the favela, there is the experience of alterity in the city. So, favelas can be understood beyond geographical fact, geographical places. They can be understood as an heuristic device, and they can serve to different methodologies that can help us to brush history against the grain, like Walter Benjamin puts it. But also they have epistemological dimension, because they reveal that the head thinks where the feet step, as Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator, says. Uh, that means different people will think about the city differently because they step in different places in the city. And also, as CLR James puts it, uh, they can unfold the ontology of people who are in Western civilization, who grew up on it, but who are forced to feel, and in fact do feel, outside of it. And these people, they have a unique understanding of their society. So favela can be understood beyond geographical places and as an heuristic device to understand conflicts in real. So I wanted finally to pose some questions to you to provoke a debate because really I don't know your realities, your urban realities. I am literally on the other side of the world. Here it is 12 a.m., 2 a.m. in the morning. So are there other local categories that disrupt universal approaches to the city? Do they tell other stories about urban development? What are their contributions to plural urban epistemologies? Do they reveal the ontological diversity of the cities? Could we think about cities as contested terrain? Thank you very much. These are my references and the references of my images.
Thank you, Miguel, very much, particularly for joining us at 2 a.m. It's nice to have you here. So, two questions I want to leave with you, which I also think would help for our audience here contextualize some of your work. One of the things that you argued was about the persistence of ideas of coloniality, modernity, and progress, right, as the kind of mainstream. And I wonder if you'll say a bit more about that, because one thing that is quite striking is, India is recently post-colonial, like much of South Asia. We're talking about middle 20th century. Brazil has technically been post-colonial for almost 250 years. And so I'm interested in the invocation of coloniality because I don't think that the colonial shows up, is experienced, and means the same thing. So I think it would be really nice for us to hear about if the favela is a way to rethink some ontologies of the city, but what is that dominant coloniality when you say it from Rio? Because I think we don't refer to the same kind of coloniality. So what are those colonial continuities? I think it'd be very lovely to hear. And the second question, which it may be early, but just to hear you, when one of the debates that happens in Indian cities is whether to think of the settlement, the popular neighborhood, the basti, the cherry, as a social geography that, like you claimed it, a space of black politics. For us, it would be a politics of, say, of Bahujan politics, of Dalit politics, of Muslim politics, as opposed to a infrastructural precarity or an economic precarity, right? A class precarity. And I think that one of the things that one of the languages that has been theorizing is some of the new theoretical work on racial capitalism that is also coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That if you have to see the favela or the basti or the settlement as a racialized geography, then our understanding of macroeconomy has to also be racialized. It can't just be the favela that is racial. The whole economy has to be racial. And so therefore, new theorists of racial capitalism, and I wondered if these were some of the larger new frameworks that could come from your work, right? That we begin from the favela to rethink capitalism as a racialized process and not just a class struggle. Just some thoughts around the distinction there between class and identity, and I'll come back to you. And to say that it's really particularly nice to have here. So folks in the room, Miguel is at the Center for Favela Studies that started, I think, about a year ago at the Federal University of the ABC region in Sao Paulo. And UFABC was one of IHS's first curricular partners 16 years ago when we started, and was part of building a new curriculum that was across the South. And so to see UFABC back in the room is also really nice. So it's a pleasure to have you here. Okay, so our final paper at the end of this, who will continue our incredible timekeeping tradition is Hurmuz Yuman from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. And their paper is called Muslims at the Margins of the Metropolis, Aspirations, Imagination, and Negotiated Urban Spaces in Delhi. So over to you.
Yeah, very good morning to all. I'm glad to be here at the 10th year of Urban Arc Conference. And thanks IHS for this opportunity to present my work. So this work that I'll be presenting today is a part of my preliminary fieldwork insights that I conducted in Delhi towards my PhD study on Muslim aspirations and marginalization in Indian metropolises. So to start with the presentation, my paper is titled Muslims at the Margin of the Metropolis, Aspirations, Imagination, and Negotiated Urban Spaces in Delhi. To set the context, Muslims are a largely urbanized minority populations. They form around 36% of Muslims in India form the urban spaces. The experiences of these cities are shaped not only by economic precarity, but these experiences are deeply ingrained in spatial, social, and cultural hierarchies. So the Delhi as we see it as today it's not a case of happenstance, but it has been manifested through historical legacy of communal violence, discriminating housing practices, pre-independence and post-independence changes in cartography and the urban mapping of Delhi. Uh, what Nazima Parveen in her work on contestant homelands puts Delhi as traces the trajectory of Delhi since colonial times to the present times and how it has been shaped on the margins of communal lines on So many of the Muslim households are displaced on account of communal violence or redevelopment, and they have been resettled in peripheral areas like Silampur, Mustafabad, and Jafrabad. And they're also settled around in the southeast Delhi sides of Okhla and Zakir Nagar, which are self built localities. These places are marked by high population density, lack of basic infrastructure, poor roads, no recreational spaces. The presence of state is low, and it also has a sort of ghettoized economy. I use what Louis Wapon calls territorial stigmatization and advanced marginality to uh, to explain the experience of to show how these residential segregated areas are looked at as. So these places are credited. Decredited as socially discredited places, which are also called dangerous or backward or undesirable. Sumit Maskar, in his work, also calls these areas and associates them with terms such as karahayat or dangerous places or places which are unhygienic or filthy. So there's a sort of stigma that is attached to these segregated spaces of Muslim areas, which leads to the advanced marginality that is faced through unstable work, weak state presence, poor infrastructure, social isolation, and so on. And these places are looked at. So religion becomes a spatial code to look at these places. So they're not just localities, but they're Hindu or Muslim localities. So religion plays a role as a spatial code. Uh, so in this context, aspirations are understood not as individual fantasies, but as socially produced capabilities determined by one's habitus, resources, and capacities to access symbolic capital. I'd like to also conceptualize aspirations. So, what I frame aspirations here is not as individual dreams or hopes or ambitions, but they're something which are socially determined, which Devraj Ray in his work posits aspirations as they're shaped by the environment a person lives in, the norms, role models, peers, community members in those society. The factors that affect aspirations are economic, social factors, cultural factors, role models that a person is surrounded with, and self efficacy, belief in self, etc. Arjun Appadurai talks about capacity to aspire, wherein he does not look at tradition as something tradition or culture or tradition which is situated in the past or which is a thing of the past, but he looks at aspirations or capacities as being future oriented, and how the culture can generate aspirations and hopes for the future as well. These are some diagrams which allow me to explain how aspirations can be formed, how they can be shaped. So, every person has a set of beliefs and mental modes. These mental modes are affected by the surrounding people, which in the neighborhood that we live in, the friends that we have, the peers that we have. They're also affected by shocks, family resources, culture that they live in. These impact aspirations. In turn, aspirations impact outcomes, and outcomes impact social mobility and inequality. So there has been an extensive documentation of Muslims issues looked through the lens of marginalization and social deprivation. There's been a lot of quantifiable data that we can pose to support those claims. However, there has not been a very exploratory or a qualitative inquiry into how these communities deal with the issues that are presented to them. So, I seek to address this critical gap in understanding how aspirations are socially built, socially negotiated, and constrained at the intersection of structural inequalities, segregation, class, and political agency. So, the central question that I seek to answer here is, how are aspirations shaped, realized, constrained for Muslims in the urban localities? For this, I introduced this conceptual framework called intersectional framework of aspirations and challenges, where I place aspirations and challenges in this dynamic field where an urban locality is, how urban locality functions, the elements that it carries. So so there's an interplay interplay that emerge, which happens in this field, what Bourdieu calls as habitus, capital, and field. So I place these things at the intersection where social location, a person's religious identity, the ethnicity that they belong to, the caste that they're a part of, their gender. Cultural capital includes neighborhoods, community, network, and kinship ties, educational institutions, civil society organizations, and NGOs, their class status, such as lower, middle, and affluent classes, their educational levels, their occupation that they have, formal, informal, business ownership, and access to financial resources. Finally, spatial location in which these places are these things function, these dimensions functions, the ghettos, enclaves, citadels, or mixed neighborhoods. The methodology for my research followed a sequential method design, which happened across three phases. I interviewed around 350 male and female participants aged 18 and above. They were also key informants such as social workers, civil society organization founders, and local political representatives. Data collection method used semi-structured questionnaires, life history method, in-depth interviews, ethnographic participant observation. These places were stratified based on along spatial and social dimensions. The geographical scope of my study took me to three Muslim concentrated areas in Delhi. I started with Okhla in the southeast Delhi, which is the legend here provides us with the view that the yellow highlighted places are the highest density populated areas in Delhi, whereas the orange ones are still very densely populated areas. So this is Okhla, and this is the old Delhi area. Just a bird eye view of how congested these places are. The houses are very close together, and there's just no room for recreational purposes or even parks or places of leisure. So I'd like to present some preliminary findings from my fieldwork. Uh, Talking about aspirations, what I found was that there's a across all locations, there's obviously aspirations towards upward mobility, dignity, and security. Most commonly, they seek to avail them through education, education, jobs, stable employment, and independent livelihoods. All these locations, education also emerged as a central aspirational axis. Aspirations for government jobs. So these localities also posited different kinds of aspirations that people held in each localities because of the proximity of educational institutions and universities such as Jamia Millia Islamia. We can see an educational spillover in areas within close proximities of Okhla, where where there are aspirations for government jobs, professional careers, and white collar employment. Whereas Whereas in contrast, the Northeast Delhi Jafrabad region articulated more limited educational aspirations. However, their aspirations were accompanied by an early shift towards income generating activities and entrepreneurial presence with the both formal and within both formal and informal economy. Alongside education, aspirations for owning small business, textile mills, retail shops, food stalls, tea vendor shops were in widespread, reflecting economic necessity and a desire for autonomy, apna kam. These entrepreneurial aspirations were especially more pronounced in Jafrabad and Old Delhi areas, where there were family-based trades are more in prominence and informal market structure livelihood options. When we talk about negotiated and deferred aspirations, personal ambitions are mostly in these areas deferred or abandoned due to familial responsibilities. Young men who had aspirations for higher education, sports career, often reported entering informal labors such as in karkhanas due to financial constraints. I could also see what I classify as intergenerational displacement of ambition and aspiration, whereas respondents display intergenerational deferring of personal ambition. So, if a father or a mother has ambitions for themselves, they would defer it to their children so that they could invest in their hopes and their futures. Generational differentiation and aspirations. Young respondents articulate a more individual set of aspirations, wherein they seek social mobility, upward mobility, living with dignity, and traveling more. Whereas the older generation were more focused on their family well-being, or they were concerned about the future of the youth at hand. When I speak about gendered aspirations, so Muslim women face double disadvantage. One is because of being a Muslim, and second is because of being a Muslim, because of being a woman. Uh, these gendered aspirations are shaped by access to space and work. So when I say constrained mobility, I could see in the field there was a huge invisibility of gender. I and these places are the spaces are mostly claimed by male. Gendered aspirations here are shaped by access to space and work. They become sites where access sites have express aspiration for education, financial independence, and dignity. Women in northeastern Delhi reported spatial immobility. They were mostly engaged in home-based piecework, such as assembling garment accessories and strategy to constrain economically. Locality specific aspirational ecologies. So education in Okla, future oriented aspirational culture shaped by education. They were mostly aligned towards white collar jobs, due to civil society activities. Northeast reflected a more survival orientation toward aspirations, and they were closely aligned with immediate economic needs and in informal labor pathways. In Old Delhi, we see a mixed picture where traditional based aspirations persisted. New initiatives such as community libraries and cultural spaces focused on reading and reclaiming Urdu literary pathways. Finally, aspirations shaped by safety and belonging. So, in most of these interviews, there was a desire to move out of these localities because in search of better infrastructure, in search of better schooling, education for their children, just better roads, even. But due to housing discrimination, communal violence, or fear of safety and security, they resorted to stay back into these areas. I'll take you through some of the
Hormuz, I'm afraid you're at time and a bit over. So can I ask you to take a minute or two and conclude, please?
Yeah, for sure. So the challenges, I would like to show some of the snippets from my field. These are locations in Delhi, Okhla, Jafrabad, which show that these places are bereft of hygienic conditions because of low presence of state authorities, which should intervene in providing welfare in these societies. The houses are so strongly, like they're so uh, closely built that this is only 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and rarely any sunlight reaches to the ground. These are some more photos from the field. This is a picture of a karkhana. An interesting finding that I wanted to share was the Karkhana system in Jafrabad, where boys enter labor at the age of 14. There's a Biradari network that is formed in these places where if you enter a Karkhana and you ask the person where that person is from, if they're from Sambal or Amroha in UP, then the entire Karkhana workers will be from that place. And that shows how Biradari networks help aspiration formation and realization of aspirations. I also wanted to highlight this important work that my research also looks at how in a welfare state where the people are dependent on government or state authorities to provide them with basic amenities, basic facilities such as proper education, reading space, libraries or reading spaces, how civil society organizations, NGOs, and Biradari networks are trying to fill in that gap. These are obviously not transformative, but they still help in meetings and bridging some of those gaps. So I these are some this particular city public library was a room in a mosque where some concerned NGOs, some concerned residents of the vicinity formed an NGO and mobilized to make this library where to inculcate the habit of reading and studying and preparing for competitive examinations. These are some other institutes, some other.
Sorry, can I ask you to, yeah, last slide, yeah, conclude? Yeah,
Yeah,
sure, where you want
uh,
to finish. Yeah.
I'd like to conclude by reading this out. These findings demonstrate that aspirations among urban Muslims are neither absent nor culturally deficient. Rather, they're shaped within a field where social identity, spatial segregation, class position, and access to networks interact to constrain what futures appear possible. Spatial concentration limits exposure, informal labor regimes truncate educational pathways, gender mediates access to public space, and infrastructural deprivation undermines capability formation. While community networks as civil society initiatives partially mitigate these constraints, they remain compensatory rather than transformative. Aspirations are widely present, the capacity to aspire is unevenly distributed and shaped by spatial exclusion and institutional barriers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll leave my question for you and then open it up to the floor. Is there? So I wanted to just push your arguments in two ways, and if you could respond. One is there is a very strong debate right now about what categories we take to describe particularly social, caste, and religious spatial patterns in Indian cities, right? Because the language of segregation, the language of ghettos, the language of advanced marginality. I mean, Louis Quecon's work is in Paris, where the construction of the banlieues that he refers to as state-produced racialized public housing, right? So there is an intentionality that's to be read. So I wonder if you could reflect on what it means to have concepts that then move from contexts that are very different from ours, right? And use them here, like what moves and what doesn't. And just to think about, it doesn't mean to say that those concepts can't be moored here. The second is also to think a little bit about, while there are certainly questions of power and discrimination and exclusion at play, to analytically be specific also about the way our research then handles the fact of what the other speakers have been saying, that part of our language is part of the symbolic separation as well, right? So when we think of neighborhoods as Muslim neighborhoods, what work does that do? And what does it do to neighborhoods that are not, that then get read as what? Right? So Chandni Chowk to me is a very particular example because actually empirically it is not Muslim majority. It has not been for a very long time, right? And it is also very different because its surrounding economic geography is very different from Jafrabad. And Jafrabad is, post the sort of programmatic directed violence. And so how do we allow neighborhoods to also have multiple plural ways of being and belonging in the city, where the question of separation can equally be tied into the question of tissued and togetherness, right? So there is a lot of work, for example, that has come out, new ethnographic work from Jamia Nagar in Delhi, where residents have also written work that contests this language of Jamia's isolation and its segregation, and has other words of what it means to build a neighborhood that is, yes, a part and part at the same time. So, how do we struggle a bit with these classifications in order to not reproduce neighborhoods in a way that we're also contesting? Right? So, but just some reflections on that language. Okay, so folks, the floor is open for questions, and I will read one that's come in the Q&A box. Folks online, the Q&A box, not the chat, is open to you. So while the mic goes around the floor, there is a question, Munazza, for you from Lareb Ghazi, who says, since this excess of segregation is particularly seen in South Asia, have you come across particularities of South Asian planning in history that produces this sort of governance? So I'll just read it again. Since this excess of segregation is particularly seen in South Asia, have you come across particularities of South Asian planning in history that produces this sort of governance? That's a question I'd leave. There is a second Q&A online, which I'll take after, and let me go to the floor. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the brilliant presentations. I have a question and a comment for Sumandeep Kaur. And so the question is, if you could please elaborate a little bit on this interesting concept of like casteism in Sikh religion and or in this Sikhist context. And the comment is, for example, like in my hometown of Goa, it was predominantly Hindu population, and during colonial rule, a huge section converted to Christianity. That includes like my mother's family. And what they did is they took their castes with them and just gave them Konkani names. So now we have Catholic castes for the same thing. And I also read research on like certain Dalit communities when they are, especially in the leather sector of like the Chamatkars and all, when they tried to convert to Islam, they also were unable to break away from casteism. So I was wondering, when you mentioned like this casteism, is it only like the Valmikis who came and joined who have this castes now in how it's kind of still perpetuated? Or is there also in like Sikh communities who were originally and always Sikh, is there a sort of casteism there as well? I would find that really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, good. So we can still, so what, you all have a question from me as well. So why don't we open responses with Sumandeep, and you can answer both mine and the question, and then we'll take more if they come in. Over to you, Sumandeep.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Basically, I mean, when we talk about this whole idea of casteism in Sikhism, and I'll also respond to the question that Dr. Bahan had also asked to me. I mean, when we look at otherwise the structure of Sikhism, and even for that matter, when we respond to the question of Sikh scriptures, so there is no like issue of casteism. If we look at the composition of Guru Granth Sahib also, it is fundamentally inclusive. That is the Bani of Sant Kabir, Baba Farid, Bhagat Namdev, Ravidas, and many of the other saint poets that those who belong to diverse social and caste backgrounds, that is very central to the text. And so there is a kind of textual inclusiveness which like clearly rejects caste hierarchy at the level of the spiritual philosophy. However, in practice, like over the time, we have seen this thing that, like in social practice, Sikhs have diverged from these principles. Now, this we see, I mean, the question that this in the audience that I was asked about, that is like, I mean, there is not this thing that there were like originally Sikhs. Basically, it is like Sikhism is a 500, 550 years older religion. And many of the people, those who came to Sikhism, that is like they came from Hindu religion itself. And then later on during the colonial period, we see a major shift basically. That is when this census happened, and so the caste as an identity was included in that. That also played a major part in, like we can say that, entrenching these divisions. And so in a way, like, these caste identities and hierarchies, they have like persisted in Sikh society through spatial segregation, through marriage practices, and even through occupational inheritance also. I mean, in Punjab, overall, if we see that there are like Sikhs, but even in Sikhs also there is dominance of one community. And when you go to the Dalit communities, then they are also divided into 39 communities that constitute like total of the 32% of that. So there are so many hierarchies even in them also. So in a way, like, and the question that sir had asked me, that is like, there is not like in a way structural absence of like, we can say scriptures as such. That is there in scriptures, but in practice, because of the in like the influence that they have gained over the time period, like the kind of society they have been living in, so that has led to, I mean, this question of this caste system, and that has led to many of the other developments also, like for example,
Sure.
the culture of deras and all that. Yeah, I don't want to go into that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Swanti. Let me go to Maitli next. And for all speakers, if we could be somewhere between 2-3 minutes so that we wrap at that.
So to answer your the first question, which I understood as how because it is so coded, linguistic identity is so coded into the constitution of the country, I guess what a city can do is, this is something that has been my observation. So I speak Kannada. I've spoken Kannada all my life. It's my native tongue. But when I'm in a space where I live in a place where the majority of the speakers speak Kannada, but when I go to spaces like places, areas like Coxtown, like Benson Town, towards the other side of Cubbon Park, I listen to so many tongues. I see so much of difference, and there is no sort of imposition of that difference, but there is a sort of harmonious nature in it. And there is, because there is the existence of difference in such a harmonious way, it it is it sort of gives it sort of allows for a sort of an identity to be created that is not enforced by the constitutional linguistic identity. And I think encouraging spaces like that, and encouraging mixed neighborhoods, and sort of there, even in my paper I observed that there is a flattening of neighborhoods, where neighborhoods are sort of limited to people who uh, belong to a certain caste or belong to a certain class. I guess that also sort of brings the question of who do we consider as uh, who do we consider as forming the identity of a place and a space, and who do we sort of deliberately exclude from it, and who do we consider as the us versus them question. And the second question about how naming also sort of undoes the act of language, I would say the language imposition, is that when I've seen, when I meet my friends, a lot of my friends who do not speak Kannada, who speak other languages, they say that it has sort of almost prevented them from appreciating Kannada as a language and appreciating the history and culture of the place, because they feel that they're forced to learn the language and they're forced to appreciate it. And as someone who has who loves and appreciates appreciates the language so much, and as someone who sees the way it has grown, and the way the literature and the culture and the cinema and everything in it works, it's quite a tragedy to see how the intent with which the imposition happens, it almost backfires when it comes in, when the resistance comes into it. So I do believe there must be different ways in which preservation of language should happen, because language is important to us. Language is, of course, is
Sure.
culture, is people. So I guess I would really want to see the different ways in which it can be appreciated, or it can be preserved, and it can be understood without having to sort of use it as a flattening device.
Sure.
So yeah.
Thank you. Munatza, can I come to you?
So am I audible? Um,
Yep.
So I would briefly touch on the fact about publics and commons in Kashmir, which you pointed towards, Gautam. So it's not exactly an answer in that sense, but it's in that direction that there are two aspects to it. First of all, is that in Kashmir, because of its hyper precarious precarity, it does not. It still somewhere I feel like neither exists fully as publics or not fully as commons. There is that kind of precarity, and urban commons also exist as contested, especially for women here. Second thing is that why sacred spaces are so important for public life or as a public sphere or as an urban commons is also because there is this public life in Kashmir that is highly militarized, it is securitized, it's surveilled in a sense that existing in public spaces like parks or around water bodies, normally where you exist like that, it is commonly understood to be highly surveilled in a sense that for a lot of places if you want to gather you need to get permissions, police gets involved, in a sense that religious spaces kind of do more. And um, I would also like to point towards this thing that Batul also mentioned in her paper is, and this is something you also mentioned about publics not considered to be mostly secular, uh, is because when we talk about institutions or religious institutions in non-Western context, there's this assumption that they are in Western context, is this assumption that they're supposed to be more private or they're supposed to be non-rational. But the reality is, at least in Kashmir, is that the religious establishments are so politically entangled and they both add into each other, especially like we say Jamia Masjid. Uh, Sometimes we jokingly say that it's not a mosque as much as it's a place of protest because I don't think people get to pray as much there. Um, the protests also go towards other things. For Palestine, for instance, Muharram processions has been used for protest against Palestine, and there's also this insistence on less state intervention. And also because it's Kashmir, there is something else at play. Also, why the independence of these from state matters. Um, for women especially, these sacred spaces take the private practice of their religion to a public domain. They also takes it from a domestic practice of religion to a public practice of religion. In that space, in that sense, that shrine visiting also becomes a sense of spatial practice. And I would move on to Lareb's question about what is the particularity of and again, the patterns that you see in South Asia is something that exists in Kashmir, but the specificity of Kashmir is its urban political particularity, because sacred spaces in that sense have had to absorb civic spaces when you're in a very fragile, politically fragile environment, because public spaces are very securitized. As far as religiously looking at how religion is practiced, the religious orders, the Sufism and all, there is a certain specificity to it, but it gets subsumed in the larger political context. Um, um, Ultimately, the sacred spaces in Kashmir, the asthans, the dargahs, the mosques, khanqahs, they have to do more work in Kashmir. They have to carry more weight. And in that sense, they also, shape women's presence more intensely. So I hope that answers the question. I'm going to stop here.
Thanks a lot, Manoj. I'm struck also by very deep parallels to what in Latin American anti-dictatorship democracy movements from Chile to Argentina to Brazil was called liberation theology, and the role of the churches within favelas and spaces as spaces of political gathering and protest, the only place you could hide from the military. And I think it's this overlap of the sacred, the civic, and the political, I think is a really interesting way to think of how social spatial formations come, both particular to Kashmir, but also not only in Kashmir. And I think that both that particularity, but that commonality is so important to hold on to. Thank you for that. Aishwarya, let me come to you.
Yes. So To the question on what kind of things we say before we leave home. So sometimes, obviously, there is work that they have to do. They're involved in domestic work, but also, like for example, Mariam is running the shop with her mother, and that is the kind of livelihood that sustains the house. So she has a scooty, which the others don't, and so they kind of state that reason, but also sometimes they have to outright lie about
Mhm.
going out. So this one instance where Salma tells her parents that I have an exam in my tuition center, but she goes to the park with her friends. And this is also risky because in that event she kind of loses her friend's scooty keys and has to kind of stay there for long and find the key, and it's a whole kind of thing. And because once trust is also abused in the family, then the next time they cannot
Right.
kind of use that same thing. And the other about the film, so in some ways some spaces are more accessible digitally. So Mariam and Salma, they tell that, uh, we didn't know this place existed in Bhuj until we saw it on someone's story. And that's also kind of interesting. And so when this whole film idea came up, they were quite bold about it. Like Sajida, when we were filming in the settlement, she would like tell the neighbors, yes, I'm making a film on you and it is about you. And she would be like very bold about it. But allowed her to say some things would otherwise be very difficult, because then she would be kind of exposed in the community, and she feared that exposure in her community. Mariam also, she in the beginning she was okay with filming her face, and her face is completely shown in the film. And she's been raised by a single mother, and so she feels like she has a little more independence than the others. um, and so when she showed some of these clips to her mama, who is like the de facto father in this situation, he kind of got very furious about, why is your face being shown? Why are you saying all of these things? You're kind of portraying us in like this negative light. And he asked her to delete a lot of things. So the surveillance also kind of seeped into the film, of removing a line here, don't say Muslim, don't say that, don't mention the name of the basti, change your name. uh, and so I mean, yes, it was a back and forth. And we also screened this film in the neighborhood, and they were quite scared about it, but a lot of the women were relating to it, and they felt like they're being seen, so they had this kind of support. So yes, in a way they
Yeah.
made some claims which were beyond what they could have done otherwise. Yeah.
Lots to hear about, but really lovely. Miguel, and then we'll close with Hermos. Miguel.
So, first, answering on the context of ideas of Brazilian coloniality, I think maybe if I explain a little bit about a regional category, uh, Latin America category, periphery, uh, it brings the idea of what we think about coloniality, because we think ourselves as a periphery of Europe mainly, because Europeans came here and slaughtered all our indigenous people, and they wrote their own history in a blank paper by white hands. So this is our history. Our history was erased, and our cities are struggling to build upon other ontologies than those of the Europeans. They did this. They conducted a project of brutal extraction, and of our resources, of our people. They brought a lot, millions of African people here to be slaves to their colonial project, and therefore there are many colonialities that remain. So we don't think about ourselves as a post-colonial country. We rather think about the colonialities that remain today.
Sure.
So that's a little bit about how we think coloniality in Brazil. It's a
Mhm.
thing that's very present. We have a very racist society. So this is not a history of the past; it's the history of today. And about racial capitalism and how black politics help to build uh, other imaginaries of capitalism. Uh, I think the favelas are, in a way, being used by many social movements in Brazil, black movements, but not only, to rethink the city. And while we rethink the city, we are rethinking also capitalism. And
Mm.
there are many social movements in Brazil that are trying to write and to create public policies from the favelas to the city. So this is very
Mm.
a disruptive way to build upon other imaginaries of capitalism.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Hermes?
Yes. So first addressing your question on the concept of advanced marginality by Walk-on. I agree that in the Indian context, we need to contextualize the framework of territorial stigmatization, because Walk-on looks at from the lens of race and in the Euro-American sense. So to contextualize in the Indian context, we need to bring in religion, we need to bring in caste, we need to situate it in the social fabric of our own country. In this and how it operates. Therefore, advanced marginality also can be translated and emerges as weak and uneven state presence. So there is some contextual changes that needs to be made, and I supplement it with with theories of social exclusion and how exclusion operates in creating these residential segregated spaces of Muslims in India. The second question was on the multiple belonging in the city and categories that we use to name these Muslim areas, how they are categorized as being just Muslim areas or just Hindu areas. So how they're viewed as is because of this ethical concentration, and I do not like to use the word ghettos or enclaves because they're highly contested words, and they somehow blame the victims in creating this sort of place where they have uh, voluntarily or by their choice organized into these places. I like to classify them more as negotiated urban spaces, because these are produced through historical planning, partition through planning done by authorities and development authorities. They're contemporarily also they are getting dynamically changing with even we can see in the 2021 Northeast Delhi riots, these places get reshaped into more concentrated Muslim areas through rehabilitation and constant resettlement of refugees coming from uh, communally violent places. So I'd like to term these as adaptive urban formations, which are transforming through these negotiations. And
Sure.
yeah, the last question that I see in the by Larib Ghazi is how do I read the anti-CNRC movement through my framework of aspiration? So I situate it as aspirations also include aspiring for one's dignity, recognition, and political belonging. So this is a great place to reclaim your political identity, your identity as a, especially as seen in Shaheen Bagh. There was this movement was a collective aspiration of an entire community to show that they recognize what their constitutional standing is, and they practice their equal membership of this nation and state. And finally, methodologically, which localities in Old Delhi did I treat as Muslim locality, given its mixed character? The zones that I selected were based on different concentration of composition of different religious groups. Two of these locations were densely Muslim concentrated areas, but Old Delhi and Old Delhi is a huge area. I looked at the Daryaganj, Pataudi House, Chandni Chowk, Chandni Mahal, Matia Mahal. So these are all historically a mixed religion coexisting together, mixed community society. So I look at Matia Mahal mostly as Muslim populated concentrated areas, but everything else I take it as a mixed community because I also wanted that to be represented in my study, wherein two communities intersect. That's all.
Thanks.
Uh,
Thank you all to all the panelists for a really, really nice set of presentations to get us started on this day, and particularly for allowing a panel on sacred geographies to, in a way, remind us of not in so much of our work the religious gets separated into the theological and the division of the scriptural, but to see it as such a dynamic, urban, present, contemporary force between the social and the symbolic and the spatial, and to see all and how it sort of intertwines corporeally through caste, through gender, through space, through the city. And I think it's and the commonalities in the way many of you have asked questions, I think also remind us of work across sites that actually has so much to say to each other if they all ask similar questions from very different places, regardless of sort of, concerns and disciplines. And I think that's really the promise of a lot of interdisciplinary urban work. And I also wanted to say that actually I wish Aishwarya, Nazat, Sumandeep, some of you also here in person, because some of the presentations yesterday, I'm thinking of the work from Nirantar on the ethnographic everyday of in schools. There's so much commonality to those stories. So I also hope that in that conference program, you reach out to each other some way, because I think collectively, there are archives being produced across all our projects. And I think there's something to be said about placing those archives next to each other so that all of our spaces get to not just be them, but in conversation, and all these archives begin to add up. I think that's the promise of collective thinking and collective theory making. And we'll bring Miguel in along for the ride from across the world, but at 2 p.m. next time and not 2 a.m. So thanks for joining us as well.